Can't Escape the Magic by Artfax. Chapter 18. Breakfast was a quiet affair that morning. Sinbad noticed that Cinna was watching the adults warily while he and Noct tried to tug the unusually quiet Aladdin into conversation. It was obvious that the little burplet at least partially blamed them for the Magi's behavior. At least, Sinbad thought resigned. That's what his glare suggests. The fare that morning was a delectable array of fruit pastries, fresh eggs, smoked fish, and warm toast. Sinbad fought a small smile as he watched Noct subtly avoid the fish, and Cinna, not nearly so subtly, sneak it back onto his plate. Aladdin nibbled absently on toast as Morgiana tried to convince him to eat more. Sinbad was not surprised to see the older girl take so easily to caregiving. It was, after all, in a woman's nature to care for others, and even a Fawnelly's woman was still a woman. After breakfast, Morgiana and Aladdin returned to their rooms to catch up on their sleep. Jafar and Masrur left to obtain the package promised by the Information Guild of Balbad. This left Sinbad with a wide-awake pair of boys, one of whom was calm and admittedly easy to care for, and another that was not so easy to care for. Cinna glared at Sinbad as the king read a smattering of administrative reports Jafar forced on him. He didn't really bother to hide the documents, as he knew neither of the boys could read. He handed them a few blank sheets of paper and some charcoal sticks to amuse themselves with while he worked. Noct was happy enough to spend a lazy day in the hotel and sat by the window to use the fresh sunlight for his artwork. And Cinna sat on the floor in front of the couch across from Sinbad. His papers were scattered on the table, and his charcoal sticks were left untouched, as he watched the older man. Sinbad did his best to ignore the passive aggression his son showed and valiantly read the reports. Still, the little boy stared at him. Sinbad tried not to show how unnerving Cinna's stare was. He hummed lightly as he read the documents. A casino on the west side wanted to expand its property, but the land they requested was currently set aside for construction of a new orphanage. Jafar wanted to have his decision on the matter sooner rather than later, but Sinbad was conflicted. On one hand, the casino was the most profitable in the country, and the annual gaming tax the treasury received from them would increase if they expanded. But on the other hand, he had already agreed to place the orphanage on the land promised. It was a difficult decision to consider, and he was frankly stumped on how to solve it. If he allowed the casino the land, the orphans would be sheltered on the west side of the island, where most of the unstable cliffs were, rather than the east, where the beaches lay. And if he refused the casino, they might renegotiate the gaming tax or pull up their business altogether and deprive Sindria of one of its most profitable tourist attractions. And this entire problem was exasperated by the fact that Cinna was still staring at him. Noct was on the other side of the room, playing with a few blank sheets of paper, folding them in various shapes, while his son was staring blatantly up at him from the other side of the table, his butt planted on the floor and his chin resting on the table. Cinna's emerald eyes were determinedly trying to burn a hole in Sinbad's head. He had no true expression on his face, just that unnerving stare. Sinbad tried not to let it get to him. He kept his own eyes firmly on the documents, but he couldn't concentrate on the words. He felt the sentences slip away as Cinna's eyes bore into him. It felt like he was in an interrogation or back under the unyielding judgment of a jinn during a king's candidate trial. He had to do something. But what? The king of Sindria looked around the room. There were no toys, there were books, but Cinna didn't know how to read yet. He had just woken up, so we couldn't send him off to nap. What in the world was he supposed to do? He looked up from the documents and met Cinna's eyes. Gold clashed into emerald as the two met eyes. Sinbad looked at his son's unblinking stare and was instantly aware of what was happening. It was intimidation. Cinna was trying to unnerve him, trying to irritate him or make him react. That's what he had been doing this whole time. Every time he had called him old man or been stubborn. Every time he had given Sinbad attitude. When he kicked him in his face, when he snapped at him, it was all done to push Sinbad into reacting. It was obvious that Cinna had very poor experience with adults. He wasn't snappy at Aladdin or Morgiana. And even Masrur didn't catch as much flack as Sinbad did. It had to be because Cinna pegged him as the leader of the group, the master, so to speak. He was pushing Sinbad's limits to see how far he could go before Sinbad punished him. To be honest, it was more than a little sad. But it was also very endearing as Sinbad thought back on all of Cinna's behavior. He never snarked at Sinbad when Noct was within arm's reach. He only made his comments when Noct was behind Masrur or farther away from Sinbad than he was. It was clear that he was using himself as not only a measurer of Sinbad's tolerance, but also as a shield for Noct. Sinbad thought of the complicated thought process that this required. In addition to the detailed plan Cinna arranged for the Fog Troop last night, it was possible that his son was a genius. He recalled hearing once that the second prince of the Ko-Empire, Prince Kome, was known as a genius of battle strategies and internal politics, and that he was an impressive general and dungeon capturer who was a vital part of the Ko-Empire's court actions. It was said that this genius prince could easily take control of the entire country, but for his loyalty to his eldest brother, Prince Cohen. If Cinna possessed half of the lauded intelligence touted by the Ko-Prince, then the first prince of Sindria would be a magnificent addition to his country. But Sinbad needed to figure out how to test him, and how to do it so Cinna ceases to see him as a threat. He had to find a way. A test that would ease Cinna's concerns about Sinbad and tell him exactly how smart his son was. The king relinquished to his son's stare and let his eyes drift back to the set of documents on the table. The documents! That's perfect! Sinbad thought, scooting forward and leaning closer to his son. Cinna looked weary at the suddenly eager expression on Sinbad's face. The little boy stiffened at the careless grin he was given. Cinna, can I ask your help with something? Sinbad asked with a winning smile. You can ask. Cinna moved from sitting flat to a crouch. A slight shift in his body language told Sinbad that he was right about Cinna being defensive and not just bratty. Javal left me some situation reports, and there is this one that has me stumped. I've been thinking about it for a while, so I'm in a bit of a rut. Could you look at it and tell me what you would do if you were in my shoes? Why do you care what I would do? I'm just some kid. Cinna said this, but he still edged forward to look over the documents he couldn't read. A king must allow knowledge to reach him, no matter where it comes from. And your youth gives you a different perspective than I have. I would really like to hear what you have to say about this, Sinbad said. He wanted to instill some kingly advice in his son. Cinna was the future king of Sindria, though he doesn't know it yet, and making sure his son was open to advice and assistance from various sources was important. His son was already wary of others, and that was good to a certain extent, but he couldn't allow his son to become anything like Ahmad, insular, selfish, and cruel. He didn't want Cinna to become oblivious to his own people's troubles. This would be a good indicator of how Sinbad should handle his diplomatic education in the future. Sinbad shuffled the papers in front of Cinna and explained the situation. There is a very popular casino on the island that wants to expand its property. However, the land they wish to expand on has already been set aside for a new orphanage. The casino owner wants to move the orphanage to the other side of the island, where there is available land. Unfortunately, the only available land overlooks a set of unstable cliffs that isn't suitable for children to be around. I want to find a way to keep my word to the matron of the orphanage about the new building, but I also don't want to offend the casino owner into leaving the island. Cinna took a long moment to think about the problem. He even snatched the papers out of Sinbad's hands to stare at them. Not that he could read them, but Sinbad thought it was cute how his son tried stalling him to collect his thoughts. Finally, after a long silence, Cinna voiced his opinion. I say keep your word to the orphanage above all else. A king who chooses gambling over homeless children is not a good king. No matter what else you do, people will still say you're a greedy man for years if you pick the casino over the orphans. You should give the orphanage the land you promise, but give the casino some incentive to stay. Convince them to build up and not out, maybe. Oh, Simba questioned. Yeah, have them build a second story or put a pool on the rooftops. Tell them to make it an exclusive offer to VIP guests so that they can drum up some extra tourism for the whole island. The increased profits the casino makes will keep them satisfied and they won't want to leave. Sinbad thought about the proposal for a long moment. He couldn't find any obvious fault in Cinna's plan. It was really ingenious, especially coming from a 7-year-old. A swell of fatherly pride made his chest puff up slightly. That is perfect, Cinna. I couldn't have thought of a better solution myself. Do you want to help me with the next document? Sinbad asked with a quirky grin. The boy nodded with only a little hesitation, his usual scowl absent. Sure, I can help. Father and son leaned over the next page of issues with twin masks of determination, eager to get to the next problem. Max stared at them from his spot near the window, his mouth agape, as it hit him just how similar the two before him were. Hints and clues came tumbling together to form quite the picture in front of him. The silver-haired boy's lips twitched as he pieced the secret together. But he didn't say anything. He couldn't. Noct simply couldn't bring himself to discern the idyllic peace that had finally come over the two purplets before him. A few quiet hours slinked by with the pair quietly hashing out ideas on different situations around Sindria, while Noct watched them avidly. He didn't understand most of what they were talking about, but it was entertaining to watch them debate. After the morning slinked by and Sinbad was just beginning to think about lunch, Jafar came back. The young assassin paused in the doorway to take in the sight. Sinbad and Cinna were not sitting on the couch, but crouched close to the table with a mess of papers before them. Noct was sitting on the couch, but he was just staring at the pair. Both father and son had their heads close together, different strands of purple intermingling. It was easy to see now that while they did have mostly identical colors, Cinna's was darker, messier, and had a fair few more split ends. But they meshed well, and Jafar was relieved to see father and son getting along. Sinbad's head lifted with Jafar's entrance. His golden eyes gleamed with anticipation. Jafar nodded to his king's unasked question, but didn't say anything in front of the boys. Cinna's own gemstone-colored eyes lifted too, but after seeing it was just Jafar, returned to the documents scattered on the table. Noct twisted around to peer over the couch at Jafar, but also turned around after giving the assassin a shy greeting. Masrur entered behind Jafar, and his welcome was a bit warmer from the two boys, making Jafar pout a little. Masrur! Noct squeaked from his seat after noticing the finalities. Cinna's head darted up with Noct's cry, and he too gave an enthusiastic greeting. Masrur, welcome back. Come over here, I want to run this by you. Masrur nodded his returns to the boys and went along with Cinna's demand to join him. Noct scurried from his seat to scooch closer to the new duo. Sinbad stood and left the group to join Jafar near the door. He could hear Cinna asking Masrur's opinion on different ecology issues from around the island. Sinbad said that the Papagorus birds like you best, and well, this floral shop wants to plant the red bream flower in their outer garden on the south side of the island, but the petals are poisonous. I think we should tell the shop no red breams, because the birds could eat them and get sick, but he wasn't sure they would eat them. I want to know what you think, because Jafar was pouting when Sinbad joined him. The two boys were so occupied with Masrur's quiet explanation that the Papagorus birds don't eat flower petals that Sinbad felt safe enough to discuss the trader situation with him, so long as they were quiet. Do you have a gift from the sect? Sinbad asked. Jafar ceased his pouting long enough to answer. Yes, Masrur and I picked him up outside the city, on the oxbow, just like instructed. We took him to a secure area that is isolated enough that no one will be suspicious of any unusual noise. We can go whenever you want. Excellent. We can leave Masrur with the boys while we handle our guest. Jafar looked uncomfortable for a moment. Jafar? Sinbad questioned. I don't think that Masrur will be left behind. What happened? Sinbad asked. One of the sect was waiting with a gift. He let us both know that the trader was infamous for torturing his slaves and forcing bastardized gladiator fights between the weak, young, or sickly slaves with the livestock he sold to the Rem Colosseum. It hit Masrur hard, and he's more than a bit eager to show the trader how a real gladiator fights. Plus, you've seen how close he's gotten to Cinna and Noct. He's as invested in getting justice for them as we are, the grey-eyed man quietly explained. All right then, but we can't just leave the boys to themselves. Who knows what mischief they'd get into. Sinbad looked helpless at the lack of adult supervision available. What about Morgiana and Aladdin? It's almost lunchtime. We could let them go and have lunch at Canton's. Jafar suggested a popular high-class restaurant that had at least 3 Sindria spy agents in the kitchen and on the waitstaff. That could work, so long as they don't wander anywhere else, Sinbad conceded, still uncertain about leaving his son unsupervised. Then it's decided. Are you ready to go? Jafar asked. Yes, just let me grab Sinbad turned back to face the room. Masrur was crouched over the short table, with Senna perched in his lap, gesturing to the papers scattered about, and Noct had clambered from the couch to hang over his shoulders, using one hand to point out his paper artwork, and the other to grip tightly onto Masrur's bright locks. The fun at least didn't seem to mind the small boys forcibly occupying his space. It was honestly the most content Sinbad had seen him in years. But they had to go. Let's give them a few more minutes, Sinbad said, golden eyes gently. Sounds fair. Jafar nodded, as always grateful and just a bit surprised at how compassionate Sinbad could be. After leaving the boys with Morgiana and Aladdin, and leaving her in charge of a modest allowance for the day, the trio of adults left them. Jafar led the way down a filthy alley littered with broken bottles and a brown puddle Sinbad didn't want to know the origin of. The young assassin crouched down and tugged a loose stone from the wall, revealing 3 sets of plain brown robes. They dressed quickly, and Jafar grimaced when Masrur's robes hung too short over his ankles. The gladiator didn't seem to mind, but Jafar prided himself on getting even the most minute details perfect in his subterfuge exploits. But the 3 men continued down the various twisting alleyways that Balbad possessed. Finally, Jafar led them to a decrepit hut on the outskirts of town. It was made of thin, moldering planks of driftwood, and lacked a good portion of the roof, too. And it was perfect. Sinbad allowed Jafar to enter first, and he tried not to flinch as Masrur shut the moss-covered door, shaking the whole hut. But it wasn't until he took a good look at the small, single room that he frowned. It was empty. There was no bound captive like he was expecting. There wasn't even a mutilated corpse that he feared. Sometimes Jafar got carried away. It was just empty. Jafar, his voice was cautious and held a fair bit of warning. Down here, Sinbad. Jafar flipped a thin, threadbare rug and exposed a dark hole in the floor. His voice then echoed as he climbed down a ladder that disappeared down into the darkness. He's down here. Sinbad swiftly followed him. Masrur waited until Sinbad reached the bottom of the ladder before he squeezed into the hole and flipped the rug back over the hole behind him. At the bottom of the hole, Jafar lit a small oil lamp that illuminated the room. In the center was a rickety chair that held a struggling figure. The male figure was tied at the shoulders, torso, waist, and ankles. A dingy bag was covering his head, and by the muffled sobs coming from under it, Sinbad would wager that Jafar had gagged the traitor as well. Some of the ropes binding him had gotten a bit loose with all his struggling, so Sinbad allowed Masrur to slide past him to tie the bindings tighter. The muffled yelps coming from the bagged face gave Sinbad a certain petty glee deep inside his chest. The bagged man struggled against the rough rope holding him. The tight bindings left thick red welts, some bleeding a little, all over the exposed skin of his arms and chest. His robes, which Sinbad could tell had been of high quality, were now torn and dirtied with dust and sweat. Sinbad kept his arms crossed over his chest as Masrur finished his tightening. He leaned against the cold stone walls of the underground dungeon. Jafar joined him silently and helped Sinbad stare down the blinded prisoner at their mercy. The dark dungeon was silent save for the uncertain cries of the struggling man. His muffled pleas were answered with neither word nor action. It was dark, and it was quiet. Eventually, the captive ceased his hysterics. He slumped pathetically against the thick rope holding him, and the bag darkened as his tears leaked through. Sinbad didn't react to the sad sight. He let the man stew in the dark, terrifying silence. He knew that whatever the man imagined would happen to him would be infinitely worse than whatever actual torture Sinbad would do to him. The human mind was capable of much more terror and violence than the body could withstand. If his spirit was already broken, his body would succumb so much quicker. Sinbad would let his captive do the hard work for him, if only for a while. The terrible fear became too much after a few minutes, and the man slumped in exhausted sleep. Jafar slid to the side, purposefully letting his shoes scrape the hard-packed floor. The captive jerked awake and let out a muffled scream of desperation. After he finished with the latest bout of tears, Sinbad decided to begin. He silently approached and leaned in close to the man's face. "Hello there, friend." The man jumped in surprise at the voice so close to his face. "Do you know why you are here?" Sinbad's voice was deceptively pleasant. The man shook his head frantically. Now let's ask some questions. Do you think you should be here? Another head shake. How cute. Don't worry, friend. Let me assure you, you do deserve to be here, and you'll know why soon enough. Muffled begging leaked through the bag. Sinbad sneered at the weak trembling. Now then, you're a slave trader, yes? So you've probably bought and sold hundreds of people in your time. Now, however much I dislike slavery, that's not why you are here. You are here because you bought the wrong person. The brown man wrinkled against this binding with a desperate fervor. Sinbad knew that he should feel a bit bad that another human being was so desperate and scared because of him and his orders. But he really didn't. Sinbad began the circle around his guest, all the while Jafar and Masrur stood by, waiting for their king. The guest trembled at the loud echo of Sinbad's shoes in the quiet stone room. The Sindrian king kept up his menacing monologue. You bought a little boy. Perhaps you intended to sell him. Perhaps you intended to keep him for yourself. I don't care. Because the boy you bought was the most dangerous victim you could have chosen. Sinbad leaned in close to the bagged man. Because you chose, he ripped the bag off his face. My son! Dark eyes blinked, startled for a moment, but they swiftly focused on Sinbad's golden orbs. Sinbad watched the reaction in his eyes, from fear to confusion to anger to a furious glee. The king leaned back, wary of the strange cascade of emotions. Jafar also noticed the change and shifted forward suddenly, ready to act. The man was gagged, but his dark eyes spoke volumes. His hair was untidy clumps of silver and hung limply over his face. His face showed recognition. He knew Sinbad. Do you know who I mean? Grunt once for yes, twice for no. Maybe it was petty that Sinbad didn't want to give the man the freedom to even speak. The man grunted. Do you know who I am? Sinbad asked. Did you know Sinbad was my son? Is that why you chose him? A bit annoyed at the nondescriptive grunting, Sinbad finally ripped the grungy rag out of the man's mouth. Fatima spat the filth out of his mouth and glared up at Sinbad with a heinous grin. Sinbad stared back at him with even less kindness. So, it was yours. After all, I chose that little brat just because he looked like you. I could have turned you not like how I wanted. So I chose him. He looks just like you. Acts like it too, the little beast. Smack! Fatima jerked back and the chair shuddered unsteadily. Sinbad shook his hand to relieve the pain from the clumsy punch he threw. Fatima again spat onto the dirt floor and grinned up at Sinbad with bloody teeth. The king looked down on him. What though? What have I done to you? How do you know me? Fatima looked shocked, his anger deflating in disappointed surprise. You don't remember me? Sinbad shook his head. I don't. It was true. Sinbad couldn't recall meeting the silver-haired man before. You destroyed my life, took my place, killed our mother. I don't remember! Fatima began shrieking and flailing against his bonds, his face crazed and furious. Mother? Sinbad questioned. The only mother he had was Ezra, and he certainly didn't have any siblings. Madeira. Surprisingly, it was Masrur's voice that brought clarity. Madeira. Ah. Sinbad was confused for a moment before the memories came forward. Madeira. Sinbad could remember her. She was a slave trader that tried to overtake the Sindrian trading company in the beginning. Sinbad had to become her slave after he lost a gladiator fight. A fight he lost to Masrur. Masrur remembered Madeira too. He had been her slave in his earliest memories. Fighting in the Colosseum to amuse her and win her money and status. She had used physical punishment and emotional manipulation to control her property. She had all her slaves call her mother. She was a horrible woman. Sinbad had organized a slave rebellion to stop her, and he freed all the slaves in her possession. You were her head slave, Fatima, Masrur quietly stated. Fatima ceased his thrashing to twist his head, glaring at Masrur over his shoulder. Yes! She was perfect! She was my master! My mother! My God! He jerked back to face Sinbad. And you took her away! You made her send me away! You betrayed her! You ruined her! You ruined everything! Fatima's shouting became pitched and hysteric. Fat trails of tears ran down his face. Sinbad roared in his face. So you hurt my son! You hurt a child to get back at me! A child that I didn't even know I had! What is the point of that? Huh? Tell me! Sinbad felt a disgusting shiver rattle in his chest. Anxious trembling made him want to curl up in agony at what Fatima said. What hurt him, Fatima? What, not me? Huh? Why not me? You! I couldn't get to you! You were a king! He was the closest I could get! Fatima roared, and then he leaned in close, lowering his voice into a near whisper. Sinbad leaned in to listen. The closest I could get was a boy that only looked like you. I didn't even know for sure if he was yours, but he looked close enough that I didn't care. He looked like you. He even acted like you in the beginning. He did? Sinbad breathed. He couldn't picture it. Senna seemed so different from him. It was always a challenge for Sinbad to connect with the small boy. Fatima nodded. Yeah, that first night he was so confident, so damn innocent. I talked about you, you know. Sinbad heard Jafar hiss quietly behind him in anger. Sinbad stooped so that he and Fatima were face to face. What did you tell him about me? Just that he looked like the trait that killed our mother, and his name was similar, and he acted like you. Fatima sighed. He was tired and sore. Did you use my name? No. But do you know what I did use? Fatima sneered cruelly. Sinbad backed away a step. What? I used the water room technique. I used light deprivation. I used whips and chains and knives. I used other older slaves to beat him and spit on him and scare him. I starved him for days and then made him watch me eat lavish meals in front of him. I made him beg to eat the scraps at my feet. I made him stand up until his legs collapsed under him. I made him hold rugs over his head until his arms went numb. I made him stand in buckets of water while denying him even the smallest sip. I beat him, I whipped him, I stepped on him, I burned him. Fatima's sneer got more and more satisfied as he watched Sinbad's face go pale. I tortured your boy until he broke, Fatima jeered. And then I tortured him some more. Ah! Furious roars exploded in the chamber. Fatima's twisted glee was cut short as he was flung to the floor. Sinbad pounded his fists into Fatima's smirking face, turning it bloody again and again. Fists rained down on his head. The cast-off of Fatima's blood speckled Sinbad's face. Teeth scattered across the hard-packed floor. Still, he didn't stop. Sinbad! He heard Jafar shout at him, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. It wasn't until Masrur physically pulled him away that Sinbad ceased his relentless swinging. Jafar pulled Fatima's chair back on all four legs. The slaver's face was a mess. His nose was broken and gushing blood. Both of his eyes were swollen and quickly blackening, and his left cheek was collapsed and obviously crushed. Blood was flowing out of his nose and mouth. Fatima made shallow, wheezing breaths as he struggled to draw breath through his broken face. Sinbad shrugged Masrur off and glared at the bloody man before him. I should torture you to death for what you did. I should leave you here to starve. But I did take your boy. Fatima's mouth was too broken for comprehensible speech. Sinbad turned to Jafar to see if he understood. The pale assassin grimaced as he mouthed, "But that won't fix what I did to your boy," over the broken man's shoulder. Sinbad scowled, but answered, "No, it won't. You're right. It won't fix anything. It won't stop him from flinching when I move too fast. It won't stop him from being suspicious of every adult he meets. It won't stop him from expecting cruelty where other children would only see kindness.
Beating you won't heal his scars or calm his fears. Torturing you won't make his nightmares stop. And killing you won't erase the horrific deeds you have done to him. My son. My only son. It won't. And I can't pretend that it does.
Sinbad let Fatima absorb that information. His shoulders relaxed, and the tiniest relieved smile began to twitch on his busted, broken mouth. Then Sinbad leaned in close and hissed, "But that sure as Solomon won't stop me from doing it anyway." Fatima's swollen eyes went wide. Sinbad retreated and turned to Jafar.
"How much time do we have to spare?"
"We have 6 hours until we meet the kids for dinner, sire." Jafar smirked.
"Good. Do you hear that, Fatima? We have 6 hours together. Is it that exciting?"
A positively jovial grin crossed Sinbad's face. It was accented well by the splatter of Fatima's blood.
"Shall we begin? I know Jafar has a cache or two down here with some interesting tools he'd like to use. And Masrur wants to demonstrate to you how a real gladiator handles his opponents. But let's save that for last, shall we? He tends to end things rather quickly, and we certainly don't want that, now do we?" Within moments, blood-curdling screams filled in the softly lit chamber and echoed up through the darkened tunnel, and they didn't stop. Not for a long, long time.